The opening scene is a fleeting glimpse of Tajikistan, before the camera follows the floating voice of Irina to her dingy apartment. She's on a call, negotiating on behalf of her friend, Paul Dedelis, who works at the French embassy, and will be returning to Paris. The purpose of the call is to arrange a transport means for some of Paul's stuff, mostly books and documents. Irina is able to finalize and let Paul know his belongings will be waiting in Paris in 3 weeks' time. She instructs him to call the same number when he finds a residence, so he can have his things delivered. Paul praises her for being so organized. She crawls in bed and he gravitates towards her, their legs and arms entwine in affection. Irina asks if he has to go back to Paris and Paul admits he doesn't miss home. It puzzles Irina as to why then he has to leave, and he answers he always knew he'd go back eventually. Irina sinks into his embrace, playfully wishing she could forget him before she changes her mind, wanting to carry the memory of him till she's old. Paul has memories of his own, stemming from his early childhood. He recalls an episode with his mother. He has a knife in hand and lets her know so. She broke into their house, and Paul keeps his younger ones behind him, ready to protect them from their mother who keeps her them. He screams at her to get out. She states he's just a child but doesn't dare finish the flight of stairs that would close the distance between her and her children. He threatens to get his father and promises to kill her if he has to. Paul's sister pleads with their mother to just leave so the commotion will cease. The night ends with their mother asleep at the foot of the stairs and Paul asleep at the top. His sister brings over a blanket to keep him warm. Paul eventually leaves home and seeks refuge in his great-aunt's house. She hands him some clothes and blankets and a sketchbook to draw in. He tells her he can't live with his mother when she asks if he's paying a visit or planning to stay long. His aunt agrees it's not easy living with their mother, Jean. Paul recalls being his brother, Ivan's, support. He remembers Ivan stealing and wrecking a bike. Paul is present when a teacher angrily reads the report about Ivan also stealing money from backpacks. Paul tries to defend his brother, but it's a lost cause. Paul doesn't view himself as his brother's keeper, nor does he really care to reprimand him about his bad actions. When they're free from the wrath of the teacher, Ivan asks when he'll be back home and Paul replies only on the condition their mother leaves. After the passing of his mother, Paul remains with his aunt for reasons being his father is verbally and physically. Meanwhile, Ivan goes to church and prays, striking light conversation with the preacher. On a particular occasion, Paul brings home bad grades and the father acknowledges him for being brilliant but lazy. He's riled that Paul didn't even pass his entrance exams and slaps him across the face. Lazy won't be tolerated, and the father emphasizes this by detailing how he worked hard for his late, sick wife and 3 children. Now that she's gone, and he's emotionally downcast, Paul will have to work. Paul reasons his father can just find a new wife to lift his spirits. His father recalls being physically by his own father, the tale sounding like a threat. Paul buffs about not feeling anything when he gets hit, but the father doesn't take likely to his response. Back to the present. Paul arrives at the Russian airport and faces some passport issues. He's interrogated about his last visit to France and he reveals 8 to 10 years prior. He's also made to reveal he previously stayed with Ivan in Raubix but is moving to Paris to start a new job there in foreign affairs at the embassy. On his first day of work, he's informed by a colleague that he's been summoned by intelligence. The colleague asks if Paul is a spy, but Paul refutes and remarks he doesn't remember who he is. They pat him down and put him in an interrogation room. He suspects there's still an issue with his passport and asks about it. The interrogator reveals Paul has a homonym in Australia. Same name, same date of birth, same place. Paul proposes the possibility of identity theft. Intelligence has done some digging on Paul and unearthed that he's been everywhere in the space of 20 years. Paul ascertains to living in Iran back in 1995, where he studied funeral rites for 6 months. He introduces himself as an anthropologist who was doing research. The interrogator asks about Paul's location in the year 1987. He shrugs, stating he's not so sure, but most probably France. The interrogator points out Paul's ID was requested to be renewed at Israel, but Paul denies ever being there. The interrogator pulls out a passport with a picture of a man using Paul's personal details, a French citizen named Dedelis residing in Melbourne. He's asked if his papers were ever stolen, but Paul can't seem to remember until the interrogator pulls out a document signed by Paul at age 16 concerning a theft claim at Russian customs. It comes back to Paul. His high school trip to Minsk because he was invited by a classmate, Mark Zeilerberg, or Zil for short. Zil's parents were in a group that helped refuseniks. Paul remembers following Zil to the synagogue to observe some prayer rites. A third guy named Serge joins them and inquires if they're still up for the meeting with the guys from Strasbourg. Serge reminds them the meeting should be taken seriously. They meet the men from Strasbourg and Serge briefs them on their mission to rescue some friends from the USSR who want to go to Israel. One of the men hands over to Zil a weighty envelope and some money to purchase 2 round-trip tickets for Gagarina. The other man, Dmitry, gives them a strip of paper with an address written on it. They are to give the envelope, containing money and documents, to a group of people that will come to them for it. The man hammers that their parents cannot know about the mission. They are to use their school trip to Minsk as a cover-up and be back with their class group before the tour around the museum is over. The man asks Paul why he wants to be involved in the mission, and Paul assets his friendship with Sil is enough reason. The man smirks, then requests if Paul would be willing to leave his passport at the scene. It would only cost him 2 hours in precinct, the man informs. Paul decides to go through with it, and the man remarks chickening out of leaving his passport is fine. What's really important is the envelope. The trip to Minsk commences with the high school students boarded on a train. Paul and Sil share the same room, and Paul keeps the strip of paper within the pages of a book so it appears to an outsider that he's reading. What he's actually trying to do is memorize the route of their mission. As they approach East Germany, their passports are required. Paul frets about getting his back, but the classmate jokingly asks if he plans to run off. He also notifies that custom at East Germany would likely check their bags. Older Paul recalls custom barely checked their bags. He remembers one of the chaperones, who was actually a comrade, slips his passport back in his pocket and tells them to get moving. Sil is the brave one among the pair, leading so Paul can follow. They recover 2 packages and 2 coats in the janitor's room of the building and wait outside for the streetcar that drops them at an odd building in the suburbs. Older Paul doesn't remember the name of the building, but remembers taking the stairwell B to a door. A man ushers them into a small apartment after clarifying it was Ephraim Ilyich who sent them. Sil hands over his envelope, and the man opens it to reveal some documents and money. Paul is also able to hand in his passport with a visa to Israel for a boy his age named Nathan. Nathan would now be his homonym, and Nathan excitedly greets Paul with the gratitude of a kiss. On their way back, they run into an officer who demands for their passports. Sil is able to show his in hopes it will speak for them both, and luckily the officer doesn't hold them for much longer, commanding them to stop loitering and keep moving. When the officer is out of sight, Paul comes up with the idea of Sil hitting him, so it appears he was robbed out of his passport. Sil can't do it, so Paul gives a black eye to himself. By the time they make it to the museum, they're 20 minutes late, and the bus for their class group has already left. They lie they got lost, but it doesn't matter. They'll be lodged in a hotel and face the police. Paul is asked to wait in the car with an officer while Mark gets interrogated. Mark claims they both went out for cigarettes, then Paul got mugged and had his passport stolen. The chaperones are present to support the story, and ultimately the scrutiny stops. Paul files a theft claim and goes back home. A year later, Mark and his parents move to Lyon, and him and Paul lose contact. Looking back, Paul tells the interrogator at least his passport helped someone in need, but asserts he had no purposeful hand in the matter and doesn't know he has a twin in Melbourne. The interrogator reveals Nathan, his twin, died 2 years ago. He notices Paul turns pale at the news, but Paul uses wits to cover up his emotions. Now on the path of memory lane, Paul can say only 3 or 4 fragments of memories has stuck with him. The third is Esther. Younger Paul returns from Paris to see family and friends. Discussion with his friend, Kowalski, reveals he's in his university days. Kowalski drives him to his former high school, where he is reunited with his sister, Delphine, who wasn't expecting to see him. Late conversation reveals Paul is studying for a bachelor's in anthropology back in Paris. He doesn't offer much specifics about his time in Paris when bugged, preferring instead to keep the air of mystery. Bob, Paul's cousin, also steps in at some point and is excited to see Paul. They all eventually leave, giving Paul room to approach the blonde girl sitting a stone throw away. He had his eyes on her even while his sibling and friends were around him. She has a cigarette in her hand and she's in his sister's class, but there's something less innocent about her. Something more daring. She's confident too, pointing out she's aware Paul has been ogling her even before he approached. She remarks she has that effect on guys, and she's aware he's noticed her for about 2 years now. She promises she can't be forgotten once noticed because she's different. They're both wearing easy smiles as they converse, and Paul invites her over for a Chinese game called Go. He offers to teach her, so all she has to do is turn up that same afternoon. Ivan still converses with the preacher. A quick scene shows him in the preacher's office discussing the story of Abraham ready to his son, Isaac, for the sake of obedience. Ivan wishes to be 10 years older, but not because he wants to be married with children. He hopes to travel to somewhere, but nowhere in particular. Paul is upstairs with a book when he hears voices and music from downstairs. He descends the stairs and finds a bored Esther not engaging in conversation with his sister and her friend, Penelope. He offers her tea and points out she's not quite friendly with her gender. Esther remarks other girls feel threatened by her presence. She flows easier with guys, but has nothing against girls. Paul reminds her of the game Go, and they settle around a table and board, so Paul can explain the rules. She admits she won't get the rules in one go, and Paul flirts, stating she'll have to come over frequently so she masters the rules. She flirts back, wearing the same easy smile from earlier on. She also points out Delphine doesn't seem to like her much, but Paul ignores that and asks if she'll be coming for a party being held the next day. Esther leaves it at a maybe. Delphine and Paul are doing dishes when Delphine shows off their mother's necklace their father gave her. She admits to Paul she's lived in fear since he left. Their father is never home and Ivan gets home late. The mention of his brother's name shifts Paul's focus to Ivan's form in a corner, praying. Delphine tells Paul about Ivan's plan to do a holdup. Ivan and a friend, Medhai, made blueprints from their stalking trips to the bank in Raubix. Delphine takes Paul to his room and shows Paul the revolver Ivan got, stashed under his mattress. She hasn't told their father, but was waiting for Paul's return to spill. Paul meets Ivan outside, where he is still praying, and confronts him about his silly ideas. He asks Ivan if he's in need of money, and Ivan calmly admits he plans to rob a bank for the mere experience of it. Paul does his best to be stern, insisting Ivan won't use the gun. Ivan claims he wasn't actually going to go through with the plan, and Paul stares at his brother incredulously but assures Ivan will have to return the gun. The next day, Paul goes looking for Francis Belkacem through the help of another friend. Francis is a dealer and Paul purchases 6 bars of hash they'll use at the upcoming party. Paul has also brought along the revolver he knows Francis sold to Ivan. He pulls it, aimed at giving it back, but Francis and the other occupants of the room misunderstand and pull out weapons of their own, ready for a shootout. Paul is able to calm them down and explain there's no bad blood. He also mentions Ivan won't be back there. The party holds at Paul's house. Ivan and Medhai handle the music, and Esther does show up much to Paul's anticipation. A lady in dazzling red, but she didn't come alone. Paul watches her and she throws a few glances back in his direction. Povelki asks if he should intervene, but Paul tells him to let it be. Delphine goes up and unexpectedly finds their dad. He's aware Paul is back from Paris and casually asks about him and Ivan. He notes Delphine should be downstairs enjoying the party, probably in the arms of a boyfriend. Delphine replies she doesn't have one and she feels rather unattractive. The father asks if she has a particular boy she likes and Delphine shakes her head. With a clap, the father reveals her brothers are taking up the space in her heart, nothing more. The father holds his daughter and plants a kiss on her head, telling her to exercise patience. Paul and Bob are on the dance floor and Bob admits he likes Penelope. He has his doubts about her feeling the same and opines she's more interested in Paul. Paul watches Esther and her older date, Michael, have a dispute. He remarks the party is full of kids and wants to leave, taking her to a club instead. She gets mean and tells him his dancing sucks so much that it's embarrassing. Michael is pushed to leave without her. With Michael gone, Esther approaches Paul for the first time since she's arrived at the party. She dances and steals glances at Paul, who steals glances of her, too. She has little chit-chat with Penelope and Delphine, and it's obvious she's much freer. When she puts on her coat to leave, Paul offers to walk her home. During the walk, he tells her about himself. Daylight is already setting when he tells her his mother is late and he had a little expenditure with his friend Mark Silberberg in Russia. He tells her about a mental breakdown that landed him in a sanatorium, but he opines he was never sick and it was only a fit. On his request, Esther reveals she's an only child and very dear to her parents. They reach her apartment door and he tells her he'll be returning to Paris the following day, but he hopes they'll be in touch. She plants a kiss on his hand and leads him inside, where they have a more affectionate kiss on the lips. It's goodbye for now, but he promises he will love her more than life. Just before he leaves for Paris, he gets beaten up by a couple of Esther's admirers. He tries to be tough and smart-mouthed. Ivan offers to intervene. Ultimately, Ivan drags in his battered body and Delphine tends to his wounds. She asks if she should inform Esther, but Paul refutes. He just wants her to write to him. Paul arrives in Paris and asks to see Professor Behanzin. He has initially refused to because he doesn't have an appointment, but he insists, stating he came from Lille University and has been trying to see the professor for 2 years. He asserts his future depends on seeing her. He's granted access and Paul goes straight to the point about wanting to study with her. She starts a quick assessment and realizes there's a hiccup. He doesn't know Greek, and the professor can't see how she can admit him if he won't be able to follow a course. Paul, with a serious face, remarks that what she needs is a bad egg, the least brilliant of the class, to reassure the rest. The professor tears at the seams with laughter. She still can't take him as a student, but gives him some coursework to attend to, and this automatically means she'll be expecting him back. Paul goes to Paris during the weekdays and is at home during the weekends. He shuffles between hostels depending on which has a spare room for the night. His ray of hope is Esther's letter to him, where she expresses she's misunderstood but missing him. He writes back to her, painting her as a goddess he's been moved to worship. Paul returns home, but his head and heart are miles away from his siblings and Penelope. He decides he'll go look for Esther, who didn't bother to come looking for him. Delphine warns she's found someone else, but Paul's mind is made up on her. Paul finds her at a bowling alley, but he keeps his distance. Esther's date tries to start a jealousy rage, but Esther isn't in the mood and tells him to go away. When he leaves, Esther and Paul properly acknowledge each other, with him moving seats to be closer to her. He's penned down Stevenson and she promises to read it later. In the privacy of his father's room, they lock lips passionately, peeling clothes and drawing apart for quick breaths. They gravitate towards the bed and Esther whispers to him to go further. He starts to oblige, but she opts to do it in the dark. Reaching for the night lamp, she sees a picture of his mother and comments on her beauty before turning the frame downwards as if not wanting her prying eyes. With privacy assured, Esther submits to a love-struck Paul. Esther's first proclamation of love is at the museum, where Paul compares her to a painting by Hubert Robert. His days in Paris are not as blissful. Sometimes he lingers in the library, waiting to get pitied and offered somewhere to sleep by complete strangers. This are on the nights where the hostels he usually sleep in are full. Esther still writes to him. In her letters she expresses she missed him enough to sleep at his place. She and his sister still don't relate, and his father has joined the list of people she's sure she doesn't like her. When letters aren't being written or read, Paul goes to different phone booths to communicate with her. During one of these phone booth conversations, Paul asks when she'll be coming to see him as he looks forward to it eagerly. Esther replies she can't afford the train and Paul offers to pay for it. Esther rejects his offer and Paul suggests she hitchhike. Esther turns down that idea, stating men mostly stop to pick her up because she's young and they're perverse. With no headway, tension builds between the lovers, and Paul ends the call in anger, walking back under the cold, slippery rain. After the fight, he finds himself writing Esther still, wanting her to come visit. Esther writes back as well, no grudges held as she's still full of affection for Paul. One day, Paul meets an older girl named Gilbert near the Sorbonne. They strike conversation and take a liking to each other, all while Gilbert's boyfriend is away. They eventually start getting intimate, and Paul mentions this to Esther in his letters, or maybe calls, and Esther accepts Gilbert. Always the opportunist, Paul now has found a more stable place to study and sleep in Gilbert's apartment. Gilbert's boyfriend, when he is around, is none the wiser, chatting breezily with Paul on the days and nights he squats on their couch. Esther takes to calling Paul at Gilbert's. Gilbert would answer the phone, find out it's Esther calling, and the two would talk without animosity, Esther even signing her letters to Paul with regards to his mistress. Eventually, Paul changes residence to a maid's room where Esther has taken to sending him pictures of herself. When he isn't being polygamous, Paul is at Professor Behansen's office, dutifully studying under her. During a particular session, she waits till he's done with his work, then takes him to the supermarket where she strikes conversation about his background. He tells her of his mother's suicide when he was just 11, and the depressed father he barely sees. He admits he avoids seeing his father because he can't help the poor man. He's been lost since his wife died. The whole lot is hanging out in Paul's house when Robert, Bob's mom, and a man named Georges come looking and demand he comes home with them. Esther exchanges words with the mom over the window, throwing down Bob's coat at some point because Bob eventually stormed out to meet his possessive mother, but stormed out without his coat. Bob's mom calls Esther rude and a brothel girl, but Esther doesn't let the woman's words do her any damage. Bob, overly embarrassed with the situation, runs off. Paul soon finds him in his apartment, that once belonged to his great-aunt, where Bob explains his parents kicked him out and he hopes to live in the great-aunt's house for now. Paul asks Bob about his siblings, so Bob admits Ivan isn't up to any menacing acts and Delphine has found a boyfriend. Bob admits he slept with Esther and tries to soothe it out by assuring a pissed Paul that Esther's heart belongs with only him. Paul is with his dad at the cemetery. While his father pays respect to his deceased wife, Paul spots his great-aunt Rose that should be deceased as well. Rose noted his father must be very lonely and wonders when he will open himself to the idea of remarrying. Paul can't understand his father's love for his mother because he never loved his mom himself. One day, Paul goes to see Esther and finds her sniffing and sobbing. She has just lost her grandmother but somehow correlates her grandmother's passing to an imminent fear of losing Paul. She expresses feeling anxious and having dark thoughts about Paul losing his life. Paul waves her thoughts are silly, pointing out she's the frail one with her constant smoking, eating nothing, and having asthma. Ironically, he says this over a lit cigarette stick with Esther having an identical stick in her mouth also. Esther remains tense, paranoid, and gloomy, so Paul suggests she goes see her friends. She asserts she has no friends. Paul suggests she tries being friends with his sister and Penelope, but Esther shuns the idea, stating they don't like her. Paul opines it's because she's too tough and closed off. Esther takes offense and asks Paul to piss off. He has friends, so he run off and go see them while she's left alone in peace. Paul asks if she's ashamed of him as she tends to follow other guys and constantly diss his sister. He expresses displeasure at the way Esther speaks and treats his family, and she retorts she doesn't care about his family or friends. Despite the tense moment, they bear themselves in Esther's bed, creating a new moment laced with kisses and soft moans. By the time Paul has to leave, Esther gets hysterical, pleading for him to stay. He tries to reason it's not the first time they've been apart, but she opens up about feeling dejected each time he's had to leave in the past. She starts to gasp, finding herself suffocating at the mere thought of Paul leaving once again. Paul barely manages to calm her down. Esther and Paul walk to the train station and Paul tries to reassure with kisses that she'll be fine. Jean-Pierre has also tagged along to escort Esther back when Paul finally leaves. Esther gets aggressive, begging him to stay, but Paul has to leave. Esther writes Paul about what happened after he left. She tells him about Jean-Pierre admitting to her about slowly losing Paul as a friend. All he seems to care about is Esther, but JP promises he doesn't blame Esther for it. He's just scared that all his friends will eventually leave and he'll remain in Roubaix. Esther mentions in the letter that JP cried at the thought of losing Paul and told Esther not to say a word about it. Paul comes back, hoping to surprise his love. She's cold and broody in response, not even wanting a kiss. He inquires if she's been seeing less of Bob like he would prefer. Esther tells Paul J.P. Kowalski would like to see him, but he scoffs, saying he has nothing to say to cunning friend. Paul does confront Kowalski about sleeping with Esther. Esther is the one who admits to Paul that they did sleep together. Paul tells JP he doesn't want rivalry and he's willingly to put their act behind them as a heat of passion. Kowalski counters that him and Esther were not confused and are now together willingly. Paul asks Esther if this is true, if she's actually chosen Jean-Pierre, and she replies with a timid yes. Voices gets raised, and Bob, who had been watching the door, is asked to leave. Paul remains in denial for a while, asking JP to leave Esther alone. But Esther insists she's made her decision. Scorned and defeated, he asks them to leave the party being hosted in his house, but JP coldly reminds him he moved out of the house already and has no say who goes on stays. Even after Kowalski's betrayal, Esther and Paul still find their way to each other, mostly in bittersweetness. Esther assesses Paul's not planning to be a family man. After graduating university, he would most likely disappoint her, he admits. Esther writes to Paul about quitting school after having a roll with her German teacher. Soon after, Paul surprisingly receives a telegram stating Esther graduated school. A week later, it's Paul's turn to get the result of his final exams. He goes looking for his beloved professor and finds her office empty. The sobbing secretary breaks the news about the professor's sudden passing, and Paul faints immediately. On a brighter side, he passed his exams. Paul signs up for his PhD but soon becomes an orphan. He doesn't go to Benin as planned and is still with Esther. He remembers the year as a bitter one where Esther starts her studies at the Lille University, works for her parents, but finds her life ultimately unexciting. She starts writing Paul almost every day, and Paul is always ready to respond. Each of Esther's letters becomes more needy than the last, and at the span of 4 years, she's had 15 lovers outside their relationship and Paul, 7. Paul receives a grant to work in Dushanbe and a few months later, Esther calls it quits. Paul calls her a pass-around, unable to survive without someone to protect her. She accuses him of never loving her, reminding him he's the one who left. She promises it's with a heavy heart that she has to hang up on him. On 2 different occasions, Ivan has to tell Paul Esther is in need of money. She moved to Paris only to struggle. Paul has a job, so he sends her money and a letter with Yeats poems. Esther receives the money and the letters, reading the letters with a smile. Older Paul now lives in France, in Paris, and alone. His work at the ministry isn't strenuous and life has been breezy. Jean-Pierre, who is now a surgeon, reaches out to him asking for Esther's address. Paul can't believe the guy and writes back, bearing his heart and anger against JP and Bob for thinking they could take his woman. Though he has so much to say, Paul never does finish or send the letter. A few months later, Paul runs into JP in a concert, and JP expresses excitement over seeing his childhood pal. By his side is his wife, Victorine, and they all agree to go for some drinks so they can catch up. JP tells Paul he wrote to him the previous year, but suspects Ivan gave him the wrong address as Paul never responded. Paul replies he got the letter, started to write back, but decided not to finish it knowing JP was looking for Esther. Better he got her address from somewhere else other than Paul. JP's wife is hearing Esther's name for the first time and questions who she is. Paul realizes now is not the time or place, but Paul keeps bringing up Esther, emphasizing her name as if to evoke trouble between the married couple. The way Paul sees it, since JP wants to bring up Esther, then they'll talk about Esther no matter how uncomfortable it gets. He rains down everything he said in his unfinished letter, calling Kowalski a predator, an opportunist who took advantage of Esther and their friendship for 4 years. Even now he can't paint Esther anything other than the 16-year-old victim that his 19-year-old self gravitated to protect. Kowalski remarks Paul is still head-headed since they last met 8 years ago, but Paul couldn't care less. JP is the one who thought it smart to contact him about Esther. Why so, knowing he never loved her? JP pleads with Paul to stop making the atmosphere so uncomfortable with his wife present. But Paul continues, remarking Kowalski broke their bro code. Sure, he and Esther weren't perfect, and he couldn't even take her on vacations, but he likes to believe their love was intact. Paul walks seemingly back home, alone. The windy air is bone-chilling from the way he hugs his coat around himself. Leaves of papers blow about the lonely bridge and Paul stops to catch one, then read. On it are Greek words that take him down memory lane once more. He remembers being in bed with Esther. They have scattered around them some Greek booklets, and when Paul points at a content, Esther easily translates. Paul can't understand why Esther quit Greek, and she remarks the alphabets drew in her interest like secret codes she could show off, but she eventually got bored with it. She gives the books to Paul as she sees no use for them. Paul tells her about the passport incident, how he gave his identity to someone else, so now he has a twin. Paul teases her to guess if he's the real or the double. She smiles reassuringly and confirms he's the real one.